All right, so my name is Catherine Youngs, and I'm going to present for you guys the article Doing Femininity in the Workplace by Janet Holmes and Stephanie Schnur, published in 2006. So a little about the authors first. First one is Janet Holmes. She got her Master of Philosophy from the University of Leeds and then moved to Victoria University of Wellington. She established the Wellington Language in the Workplace project, which is the corpus that the article here is based off of, so we'll see more about that in a minute or two. And our second one is Dr. Stephanie Schnur, and she got her PhD from Victoria University of Wellington and is interested in the role of language in leadership performance, and we'll see more about that in a little bit. There's some leadership performance in this study that we'll see towards the end. All right, so for background and related literature. So this specific work is situated in a large body of research done by Holmes on femininity in the workplace. Most of that work based off of the Wellington Language in the Workplace project. And so let's discuss the notion of style for a second. So the notion of style that the authors use in this article is very much related to Eckert's definition of style. They actually quote Eckert saying that style, like language, is not a thing, but a practice. It is the activity in which people create social meaning, as a style is the visible manifestation of social meaning. And inasmuch as social meaning is not static, neither are styles. Right, so this is the concept that people make their style, so bricolage, right? They combine different aspects of things, different aspects of language, their dress, to create the style. It's a construction. It's not something that's, it's something that constantly changes, right? So this definition of style is really applicable to Holmes and Schnur's work here, because doing femininity is not just done by women, but by men as well. So it's kind of the constructed identity of what it means to be doing femininity. And another thing we want to discuss here really quickly is the idea of double voicing, or dialogism, by Bakhtin. He was a Russian philosopher in the 1900s. And so what we've got here is that it involves a type of listening that attends to the implicit intention behind the speaker's actual words. So the idea that when you say something, you're taking into account what a kind of a background meaning that you want to convey to your audience. So we do this a lot in our everyday lives, right? So if you're knocking on your professor's door, right, and you say, hey, I didn't mean to bother you, do you have a moment? Right, and so you're thinking about what they might want as your audience, as well as trying to get their attention and ask something of them. Right, so you're taking into account your interlocutor's views and concerns when you're speaking. And yes, let's touch on communities of practice really quickly. So, right, that's Eckert's idea of making a community of who we're surrounded by in a specific action, in a specific set of actions, right? We're doing something. It's our community of practice. And we'll touch on that. Communities of practice is actually really big in this, as you'll see in a second. But first, let's go over sex or gender. So in this article, the authors do not explicitly say if they're discussing sex or gender. And if you recall from class, these two things are really different. So sex is your biological sex, and gender is the social construction of a gender. So two sexes, right? Male and female, men and women, right? And then you have gender, and there's a huge range of genders. And all right, so here we are seeing the idea of sex or gender, right? So the authors don't actually explicitly call out if they're discussing sex or gender here. So remember the distinction from class. So we have sex is biological and gender is socially constructed. And one of the shortcomings of this study is that they don't actually explicitly call this out. So this was done in 2006, and I wonder if today, a study done today, a more recent study, would actually call this out. Because it's more and more important in sociolinguistic research to kind of call this out. And another thing that's one of their shortcomings, I think, is that they're working within the traditional gender binary. And so whenever you do research, there's always going to be limitations and only so much you can study, but it would have been nice for them to call this out. And so we knew explicitly that they're studying the traditional gender binary and that they're whether they're working with sex or gender. But so in reading this, I made the assumption that they are actually working with gender, because the idea of doing gender links their discussions of femininity to gender and not to biological sex. All right, so let's look at some research question and hypotheses here. So the research question is, how do white-collar New Zealanders construct femininity in the workplace? And we've got our null hypothesis here that gender is not relevant in workplace interactions. H1, that male gender is relevant in the construction of femininity. H2, that female gender is relevant in the construction of femininity. And H3, that community of practice is relevant in the construction of femininity. And in addition to this research question and hypotheses, they have an additional overarching goal, which is, while this paper is itself a paper on examining femininity in the workplace, the authors actually attempt to represent the notion of femininity as a positive rather than negative construction in workplace interaction. So a lot of research, a lot of studies around this time, around 2006, and probably today, honestly, have a negative presentation of gender, so of femininity. So that male masculinity is kind of the baseline, right? And then femininity is the other. And so this paper wants to contribute to better future research and discussion on femininity in the workplace, and so they're attempting to use positive language in that. All right, let's move on here. So we'll look at the tools used really quickly. So this is a qualitative study, like Eckert's definition of style. So this is different than the quantitative studies done by Labov that we looked at, like the R deletion in New York City English. So those were kind of measured in percentages and things like that. And this isn't measured as much on the bar graphs of percentage of the R deletion. And so what the authors look at in the study are actually transcriptions of speech that are done in conversational analysis. And we'll see examples of those, and I'll explain what's going on there. They have some specific markups in the transcriptions. And just a quick definition on conversational analysis. An approach to the study of social interaction, embracing both verbal and nonverbal conduct. All right, so let's look at our variables here. So for independent variables, we have our speaker variables, which is gender in this case, which is actually biological sex, but what they call gender. And all other speaker variables are actually held steady, more or less. So since this is done within a white-collar New Zealand workplace, we have probably roughly the same socioeconomic class, the same age, more or less, and so the only thing that's really changing that they're looking at here is gender or biological sex. And then we have our dependent variables, and these are our linguistic variables. So what we're looking at here is, air quotes, feminine speech, which is lexical, pragmatic, discursive. There's a lot of different variation here that we don't touch on as much in class. A lot of the things we're looking at are phonological. And so what we've got here are first hedges, and so those are words such as could, may, might, and probably. Minimizers such as actually, I mean, I think, approximators, I can't remember exactly, or a bit, and doublespeak, as we mentioned before, Bakhtin's idea, right? So you're thinking of what your audience wants to hear and how you're presenting it as you're saying something. And so these feminine speech styles are minimizing the force of face-threatening implicit criticisms and directive speech acts, and we'll see that really well in one of the examples coming up later. And so these are the feminine speech styles are paying attention to the interlocutor's face needs, and that's the doublespeak coming in there. And let's take a quick look at the methodology. So what they looked at here are samples of recorded speech drawn from previously collected data in the Wellington language in the Workplace Project through Victoria University of Wellington. Like I mentioned, that's what Holmes actually, she established that one, right? So these were all collected by volunteers within the organizations, and they taped work-related meetings and some phone calls and some videotapes of larger formal meetings. And the few things that they looked at in this study here were the work-related meetings. And so one of the downsides of this methodology is that you can't elicit particular forms, right? So you can't go in and get your participants to try to say something, but you only have what's been recorded. However, it's really good at overcoming the observer's paradox. So the people who are recording are actually employees, so they belong there, right? It's not an outside observer coming in. And I'm assuming that the workplaces got used to this, got used to the recorders there, so they probably just kind of started to ignore them. Or at least it's probably what Janet hoped they would do. And so it's you're theoretically getting a very naturalistic speech there. And so this isn't quite Holmes drawing on the previous research, because she kind of started the whole Wellington language in the workplace project. So she started this project with these intentions in mind, but it is previous research in the way that it's already been done, and now she's going back and re-looking at it. And like I mentioned before, this is just one of her publications on this corpus of information. And so a little more about the Wellington Language in the Workplace project. It was started in 1996, extended to 1997, and they continued more work in 2006, actually, when they got more funding, and focusing on the language of leadership. So this is a really, really big corpus of data here. They've collected over 2,000 interactions involving over 700 people in more than 30 different workplaces, so they had a lot to work with here. So in the paper, they only looked at a few interactions, and we're just going to look at a subset of those even. So you'll see on the left here, this is the female community of practice. And so these are the transcriptions of the conversation, like I mentioned earlier. So I just want to point out a few things here before we start. So the bolded items right here are instances of feminine discourse markers. So we have actually, I mean, just, could, and let's look at, so these guys, these little plus signs here, these are pauses of up to 1 second. These overlapping slashes when they're above each other, simultaneous speech, and these are paralinguistic features, or things that they have taken out right here. So they took out the name of the funding agency for confidentiality. All right, so what we've got going on here in this female community of practice one is two women, Ruth, who is a department manager, and Nell, who is a policy analyst. And Nell has prepared an official letter, and Ruth is giving her feedback on it. So if we look through it real quickly here, Ruth starts with saying, well, it's well written. The approach it should be a bit different, right? So you're seeing the hedges and the minimizers here, and she starts off by saying, by complimenting her, it's well written. All right, and so she continues using some hedges, some minimizers, and Nell responds with just an right? There's no negative interactions we see here from Nell. And so Ruth is doing femininity here with the hedges and the minimizers and the double speak, right? So she's thinking that they're both in a situation where they need to save face, and Ruth doesn't want to insult Nell, but she wants to make sure she gets this criticism across to her, but in a nice way. And Nell so Ruth doesn't want to insult Nell, and then Ruth doesn't want to look like she's coming down too harshly on Nell, right? And so we've got the double speak here. And I'll take another example over here, and this is a mixed community of practice. So we've got Smithy, who is a project manager, and Clara, who is a section manager. And so we've got something interesting going on here. So in lines 1 through 4, Smithy is reporting on what the team agreed that Vita should have done by this meeting. Right, so Vita was to meet with IS to determine an implementation plan for the recording device, and Vita says, yes, done it. And so Clara, right, the section manager, so above both of them, kind of in the work hierarchy, doesn't say anything. And so in line 6 here, Smithy is kind of priming Clara to provide positive feedback for Vita. So Clara hasn't said anything about the fact that Vita's done good work here, and so Smithy very gently prompts Clara to do so. And so then in line 8, Clara responds with, actually, great, that'll make the plan easier. And so what the authors are claiming here is that Smithy is doing some relational practice. So as the authors say, Attending to collegial relationships and ensuring that things run smoothly. Relational practice is quintessentially gendered as feminine. So, Smithy, being a man, is performing femininity here by doing this relational practice. And so we have two examples here, one of a female community of practice where femininity is being performed with no negative repercussions, and in a mixed community of practice where, again, femininity is being performed this time by a man with no negative repercussions. And so this is, let's see, this is kind of in contrast with, so there's another example that's not pictured here. There are 6 men who are in a regular meeting of a project team, and they're discussing a technical issue that's related to a project for some clients. And one of the men has spoken face-to-face with clients, something that's traditionally feminine, right? Going and talking with your clients and seeing what they'd like. And so all of the men in the room pretend to be horrified that this guy has actually gone and spoken face-to-face with some clients. So we're going to look at another male community of practice example in a second, so keep that in mind, that performing femininity in a male community of practice doesn't always work out very well. So we've got here our male community of practice. So we've got here our 2 men, Sean and Neil, and this is a meeting for the senior management of an IT company. So Neil is a new employee, and Sean is talking to Neil and a big group of men in this meeting and saying, it's important you go to the staff meeting to get introduced, right? Neil can't make it to the meeting. So he explains why he can't make it, and Sean responds, oh, we'll think about it. And Neil continues, right? So Sean's kind of giving him a hard time here, and Neil responds with, oh, I'm sorry. So he's apologizing for not being able to make the staff meeting. And Sean starts to make fun of him, and Neil doesn't realize that he's being made fun of. He responds seriously with the elaboration of his excuse, right? He can't get out of a meeting that he's already agreed to, otherwise he would have changed it. So he's using these appeasement devices, excessive apologies, and responding seriously to this. And Sean responds with a direct challenge to Neil here. What is our formal position on Neil? And so these elaborate apologies are seen as very feminine. And so this is men doing femininity with some negative repercussions here. All right, and so we've got another interesting one here. So this is a mixed community of practice. So the situation, what had happened before this conversation you see right here, is that Jill is the chair of a board of an IT company and had a problem with her computer, and asked Douglas, one of the computer guys here, for help. And Lucy is a colleague of Jill's. Lucy's a project manager. And so Jill's very successful, but she's explaining this interaction to Lucy and says, he being Douglas, the man who helped her with her computer, says, oh, he just laughed at me. And she said, I've got this appalling reputation of being such a technical klutz. And so she's actually exploiting normative femininity here. So the normatively feminine idea that women are bad with computers, that they're technical klutzes, like Jill says. But if you look at this interaction alone, it looks like Jill is not adapting femininity in sort of a positive way. But in the other data that the authors collected of Jill, she is confident and competent. And on the recording, she's using kind of a sardonic tone. So they're saying that this reading of Jill's construction of identity right here is an ironic construction of stereotypical femininity. And so the authors say, by refusing to treat IT incompetence as a serious matter, she implicitly questions the validity of the hegemonic stereotype, which discounts the competence of women who are technically unsophisticated. So Jill feels no pressure to pretend to be any different than a man, that by not being competent at IT, it doesn't make her less competent as a woman, as as somebody in power in this company. They continue by saying, by unapologetically embracing the concept of a feminine space at work and indicating its acceptability. This powerful woman implies that she sees no contradiction between being statusful and being feminine in this community of practice. And so she's taking on this role herself of being the technical klutz, but saying I'm a woman, I am a technical klutz, but I am still powerful in this company, and that does not change that fact. So let's take a look at results here. So we've got a few different things going on. We've got, as the examples, the first one, right, with Ruth and Nell. So workplaces where feminine communities of practice are the norm, conventional femininity in discourse is acceptable and expected. It's possible that if Ruth didn't engage in those kind of face-saving maneuvers, that it would result in something unfortunate for both Ruth and Nell. It might strain their relationship. Something might not work out for kind of the business aspect of their relationship as well. And we also have men, and men can use feminine language without being marked as feminine in these conventionally feminine communities of practice. And so femininity carries no negative stigmas here. I mean, we have that example with Smithy, right? So Smithy was able to kind of do the relational practice there by priming Clara for some positive feedback for Vita. There were no negative repercussions from that one. And so we have another result, and that's that, however, in masculine communities of practice, feminine discourse will be responded to negatively. So when we had Neil apologizing for not being able to make the meeting, the other guys making fun of him, responding very negatively to the fact that he was apologizing and giving the excuses for the reasons that he couldn't go to the meeting. And then we have this third kind of interesting one, that women like Jill were able to navigate their workplaces by using traditionally feminine discourse features to parody femininity to their advantage. And so kind of knowing the feminine features of discourse and using them and embracing them anyway. And so what we've got here is actually that the third hypothesis has shown to be the correct hypothesis in this case, and that was that community of practice is very relevant in the social acceptability of the usage of feminine discourse. All right, so let's look over real quick some shortcomings of this study. So as I mentioned before, there's a lack of overt clarification on whether they're discussing sex or gender, and they're also working within the male-female binary. And as I mentioned before, it would be nice if they had addressed this. It would be great to see some future research on this. I think that'd be really interesting. And last shortcoming here is that they didn't discuss the social status of femininity. And so it's kind of implied throughout the paper that femininity and feminine speech is a lower social status than masculine speech. But there's no support in the paper for how they're able to claim that it is lower indexed. So is feminine speech explicitly viewed as negative? I didn't see any sort of interviews, right, with anybody in these workplaces who said, oh yes, people who talk like women, we look down upon them. There's nothing like that they included. And do the speakers even know that they're performing femininity? Especially the men in mixed workplaces, do they? So if Smithy was in a meeting of all men, would he not perform the same feminine discourse roles? It's something the paper didn't explore. It's possible that in all the other publications that Holmes has, it's possible that she explored that there. And then in the example of the all masculine discourse, when they were mocking Neil for apologizing, are they mocking traits associated with femininity because they're feminine, or for another reason that we don't know? So the authors kind of made these assumptions without providing explicit background on why that would be. So I thought that was one of the shortcomings here, but again, it's possible it's elaborated on in other research. All right, so let's go over some key ideas here. So we've got femininity as a constructed identity. Like Eckert's bricolage, using different features of discourse, different features of language to construct a feminine identity. And so we had the hedging and minimizers and the doublespeak. And really importantly, that communities of practice influence the acceptability of femininity. And so in the mixed communities of practice and the feminine communities of practice, femininity was accepted, no problem. And in the masculine communities of discourse, it was mocked. And so then following on that femininity can be performed by men and women to varying degrees of acceptability. And then this last interesting idea that some women in power boldly use traditionally feminine markers to assert their place as feminine, but no less statusful than men. So we have Jill, right? The example Jill of Jill saying, you know, oh, I'm a technical klutz, but it doesn't change her relation in the company, right? She's still powerful. She still has status despite this femininity, and so she's taking that on as a role and going with it, right? So she has her status and she has her femininity. All right, so we've got our key ideas there, and that just about wraps it up. References here, and if you have any questions, please post on the Canvas, and I'll keep an eye out for them, and I'd be happy to answer. All right, thank you.